Ruby Ramsey clutched her grandmother's ruby pendant with trembling fingers as she stared at the notice board outside the Silver Springs Town Hall. "The Mayweather Ranch requires a cook and housekeeper," she read aloud, her heart leaping at the prospect of employment, only to crash against the rocks of reality as her eyes reached the final line. "No persons above 30 years need apply." The early spring breeze of 1885 carried the scent of promise and renewal. But at 34, Ruby was beginning to feel that her own season of opportunity had passed. The bustling Wyoming town of Silver Springs had been her home for only 3 weeks, and already she felt the walls closing in. Moving west after her father's passing had been a desperate gamble, her inheritance barely covering the stagecoach fare and a month's lodging at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. With her savings dwindling by the day, Ruby needed work, and soon. Not much luck today either. The sympathetic voice belonged to Edith, the milliner's assistant who occupied the room next to Ruby's at the boarding house. "It seems I've committed the unforgivable sin of living past 30, Ruby replied, attempting a light tone though the words stung her lips. She smoothed her plain blue dress, the fabric worn but carefully pressed. "I've applied at 3 establishments today, and all 3 practically showed me the door the moment they guessed my age." Edith patted her arm. "That's Silver Springs for you." Ever since that fancy hotel opened last year, every business in town wants young faces to impress the Eastern tourists. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "But you know, I heard the Valmont Ranch outside town is looking for someone to help with the bookkeeping and household management. Old Mr. Valmont doesn't care about age, just competence." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest. "The Valmont Ranch, where might that be?" "About 5 miles north. Big spread, decent reputation. The son runs most of it now, Blake Valmont. Bit of a lone wolf, that one, but fair from what I hear." Edith adjusted her bonnet. "Can't promise anything, but it might be worth the journey." Ruby nodded, determination straightening her spine. "I'll set out first thing tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and cool as Ruby borrowed a mare from the livery stable, promising the owner half a day's wage upon her return. The directions Edith had provided were straightforward enough: follow the north road until the split at the Big Cottonwood, then take the east fork until the ranch gates appeared. The Wyoming landscape unfolded before her in breathtaking sweeps of prairie grass and distant mountains. The vastness both intimidating and exhilarating after years confined to Philadelphia's crowded streets. Her father's declining health had kept her tethered to their modest home, her youth and early adulthood spent nursing him rather than building a life of her own. Now, at 34, she was attempting to begin what most women her age had established a decade earlier. The Valmont Ranch gates came into view, a sturdy wooden arch bearing a simple V brand. Beyond it, Ruby could make out a substantial 2-story house, several outbuildings and corrals containing horses that even her inexperienced eye could recognize as fine stock. Taking a deep breath, she guided her borrowed mare through the gate and toward the main house. Before she could dismount, the crack of gunfire split the air. Ruby's horse reared, nearly unseating her as 3 more shots followed in quick succession. Heart hammering, she clung to the saddle and looked wildly around for the source. "Hold steady there," a deep voice called from her left. Ruby turned to see a man striding toward her from a small shooting range set up near one of the outbuildings. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his surroundings. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes that assessed her with sharp intelligence. "I apologize for startling your horse, madam," he said, reaching for the mare's bridle to steady the nervous animal. "We don't often get visitors this early in the day." Up close, Ruby estimated him to be in his late 30s, his face weathered by sun and wind, laughter lines at the corners of his eyes, suggesting a temperament less severe than his current expression indicated. "Are you from the bank?" he asked, his tone cooling slightly. No, sir, Ruby replied, regaining her composure. I'm Ruby Ramsey. I heard you might be in need of someone to help with bookkeeping and household matters. She straightened her shoulders. I'm experienced in both areas and seeking employment. He studied her for a long moment, then removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a touch of silver at the temples. Blake Valmont, this is my father's ranch, though I manage the day-to-day operations now. He gestured toward the house. You'd better come inside, my father handles the hiring. Ruby followed him to a hitching post and dismounted, smoothing her skirts and adjusting her bonnet. The house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built of sturdy pine logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Inside, the main room was spacious and surprisingly comfortable, with well-worn leather furniture, bookshelves lining one wall and a stone fireplace dominating the other. "Father," Blake called, "we have a visitor about the position." A door opened, and an older man emerged, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick. Though stooped with age, Gerald Valmont possessed the same intensity of gaze as his son, his white hair and beard neatly trimmed. "Well now," the elder Valmont said, "who might you be, young lady?" Ruby introduced herself again, explaining her background in Philadelphia, her experience managing her father's household and accounts during his illness, and her need for employment. "And your age?" Gerald asked bluntly. Ruby hesitated only briefly. "I'm 34, sir." Blake, who had been leaning against the fireplace mantel, shifted slightly. His father merely nodded. "Can you ride well?" Gerald continued. "Adequately, though not with any particular skill," Ruby admitted. "Cook, yes, quite competently. Handle accounts, read and write clearly." "Certainly. Ever manage a household budget? For years. My father was a merchant with a modest business. I kept his books and managed our home." Gerald nodded again, then glanced at his son. "What do you think, Blake?" Blake crossed his arms. "We need someone who can withstand the rigors of ranch life. It's not Philadelphia out here." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Valmont," Ruby said, meeting his gaze directly, "and I learn quickly." Something flickered in Blake's expression, surprise, perhaps, at her directness. "The position requires living here at the ranch. It's too far to travel daily from town." "I understand," Ruby replied. "I'm currently boarding in Silver Springs but can relocate immediately if hired." Gerald tapped his walking stick thoughtfully on the wooden floor. "Miss Ramsey, would you mind waiting on the porch while my son and I discuss the matter?" Ruby nodded and stepped outside, her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see the two men in serious conversation, Blake gesturing occasionally while his father listened. After what seemed an eternity, the door opened, and Blake beckoned her back inside. "Miss Ramsey," Gerald said, "we'd like to offer you a trial period of 2 weeks. If you prove suitable, the position will become permanent with a monthly salary of $25 plus room and board." Relief flooded through Ruby. "Thank you, Mr. Valmont, I accept. Blake will show you where you'll be staying and explain your duties," Gerald said, moving toward his chair. "You can start tomorrow if that suits." "I can gather my belongings and return today," Ruby offered. "No need to delay." Blake raised an eyebrow. "I'll drive you back to town to collect your things." His tone suggested he was still reserving judgment on her suitability. The ride to Silver Springs passed in relative silence, with Blake offering only occasional comments about the ranch operations. Ruby's attempts at conversation were met with polite but brief responses until she finally asked directly, "Mr. Valmont, may I inquire what reservations you have about my employment? I'd prefer honesty to uncertainty." Blake's hands tightened on the reins. "No reservations, Miss Ramsey. I simply need to see if you can adapt to ranch life." "Is it my age?" Ruby pressed, watching his profile, his jaw tightened. "Age is irrelevant if you can do the work." "That's not the prevailing opinion in Silver Springs," she replied. "I've been turned away from 3 positions in the past week for being too mature," Blake snorted. "Town folk have different priorities. They want to appear progressive and fashionable to attract Eastern money." He glanced at her briefly. "Out here, we care about capability, not calendar years." The words were reassuring, but Ruby sensed an undercurrent of tension that suggested the matter wasn't quite as simple as Blake made it sound. At Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, Ruby packed her meager belongings into one trunk and a carpet bag, paid her outstanding bill, and was ready to leave within the hour. Mrs. Holloway seemed genuinely sorry to see her go. "You're a good tenant, Miss Ramsey. Quiet, clean, and prompt with your rent," the landlady said. "I hope this position works out for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. So do I," Ruby replied, glancing at Blake, who waited by the wagon, his tall figure drawing curious looks from the other female boarders. On the return journey to the ranch, Blake was marginally more talkative, pointing out landmarks and explaining some of the ranch's history. "My grandfather established the Valmont Ranch in '46, he explained. "Started with 20 acres and built it to over 6,000. My father expanded the cattle operation, but I've focused more on horse breeding in recent years." "It's an impressive enterprise," Ruby commented, genuinely interested. "How many hands do you employ?" 12 regular hands, more during roundup season," Blake replied. "Cook named Hank, who's been with us for 15 years. Foreman's Tom Miller, good man. He and his wife Jenny live in a cabin near the west pasture." By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Blake carried Ruby's trunk to a small but comfortable bedroom at the back of the house, accessible through the kitchen. "This will be your room," he said. "Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. Sundays are quieter, but there's still work to be done. Your primary duties will be maintaining the household accounts, inventory, correspondence, and general management of the house itself." He hesitated. "My mother passed 5 years ago. Since then, things have been functional but not particularly organized." Ruby nodded, understanding the unspoken explanation for the layer of dust on the furniture and the general air of neglect in certain corners of the otherwise well-built house. "I'll start with an inventory and assessment tomorrow," she said. "With your permission, of course," Blake nodded. "I'll introduce you to Hank in the morning. He's a decent cook but ornery as they come. Don't let him intimidate you." With that warning, he left her to settle in, and Ruby sat on the edge of her narrow bed, taking in her new surroundings. The room was simple but clean, with a small window overlooking a kitchen garden gone wild with neglect. A basin and pitcher sat on a washstand, and a hook on the wall provided the only storage for clothes beyond the trunk at the foot of her bed. It wasn't much, but it was a start, her first real chance since arriving out west. With determination, she unpacked her few belongings and prepared for bed. Too tired to join the household for the evening meal, morning arrived with the crowing of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Ruby dressed quickly in her most practical dress, a sturdy brown cotton with minimal trim, and ventured into the kitchen to find a barrel-chested man with a magnificent mustache kneading bread dough with surprising delicacy. "You must be Hank," she said, summoning her courage. "I'm Ruby Ramsey." The cook grunted without looking up. "Figured as much. Boss said you'd be starting today. Coffee's hot if you want some." "Thank you," Ruby replied, pouring herself a cup from the pot on the massive iron stove. "I don't want to disrupt your routine." "Perhaps you could show me around the kitchen when you have a moment." Hank glanced up, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in suspicion. "Not planning to take over my cooking, are you?" Ruby smiled. "Not at all. My duties concern household management and accounts. I simply need to understand how everything works." She sipped her coffee. "This is excellent, by the way." A hint of pride crossed Hank's weathered face. "Secrets in the roasting," he said, then resumed his bread making with slightly less hostility. Blake entered the kitchen, already dressed for the day in work clothes and boots. He paused briefly when he saw Ruby, nodding a greeting. "Early riser. Good." He poured himself coffee and drank it black. "Father will be down shortly. We can go over the accounts after breakfast." By mid-morning, Ruby found herself in a small office off the main room, staring at a chaotic collection of ledgers, invoices, and correspondence that clearly hadn't been properly organized in months. if not years. Gerald Valmont had explained the basic system he'd once maintained before arthritis made writing difficult, and Blake had shown her the current financial arrangements with suppliers and buyers. "It's a bit overwhelming at first glance," Ruby admitted, "but I can bring order to it." "I'll need a few days to properly sort and categorize everything." "Take whatever time you need," Gerald said. "Just keep us informed of any pressing matters that require immediate attention." As the days passed, Ruby fell into a rhythm at the Valmont ranch. She rose early, breakfasted with the family and ranch hands, then divided her time between organizing the accounts, managing the household supplies, and gradually bringing the neglected house back to a state of cleanliness and order. The work was demanding but satisfying, and Ruby found herself sleeping better than she had in years, exhausted but fulfilled by each day's accomplishments. Blake remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite, but maintained a careful distance, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He spent most daylight hours outside with the horses or cattle, returning at mealtimes with the scent of sage and leather clinging to his clothes. One evening, about a week into her employment, Ruby was working late in the office when Blake entered, carrying a lamp. The house had grown quiet, with Gerald retired to his room and Hank finished in the kitchen. "You should rest," Blake said, setting the lamp on the desk. "The accounts won't disappear overnight." Ruby looked up, pushing a stray lock of auburn hair back from her face. "I wanted to finish reconciling the cattle sales from last fall. There's a discrepancy I'm trying to resolve." Blake leaned against the desk, studying the ledger. "Johnson's payment," he said after a moment. "He shorted us by $40 but claimed it was agreed upon due to the poor condition of 3 steers. Ruby nodded. "Yes, that appears to be the issue, though I can't find documentation of the agreement." "There isn't any." "It was a verbal understanding between Johnson and me." Blake's mouth tightened. "My mistake for not recording it properly." "I've created a new system for noting such arrangements," Ruby said, showing him a separate ledger. "If you'll make entries here when verbal agreements are made, I can transfer them to the main accounts." Blake examined her neat handwriting and careful organization. "You've accomplished more in a week than I managed in months trying to maintain these records." "It's what I was hired to do," Ruby replied with a small smile. "Why did you come west, Miss Ramsey?" Blake asked suddenly. "A woman with your skills could find employment in any eastern city." Ruby hesitated, surprised by the personal question from a man who had kept conversations strictly professional until now. "After my father died, there was little keeping me in Philadelphia," she explained. "I wanted a fresh beginning, I suppose, somewhere I might build something of my own." "And have you found it, this fresh beginning?" "I believe I'm finding it," Ruby answered honestly, meeting his gaze, "though it hasn't been without challenges." Blake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Rest now," he said again. "Tomorrow's soon enough for the rest of this." As he turned to leave, Ruby called softly, "Mr. Valmont." He paused at the door. "Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity despite my maturity." Something flickered across his face, amusement, perhaps. "Good night, Miss Ramsey." The following day brought unexpected excitement. Ruby was in the kitchen garden, which she had begun to reclaim from weeds, when she heard shouts from the direction of the horse corrals. Setting aside her tools, she hurried toward the commotion to find Blake and 2 ranch hands attempting to subdue a magnificent black stallion that was rearing and fighting against the ropes holding it. "Stand clear," Blake shouted when he spotted her. "This one's not broke yet." Ruby retreated to a safer distance, watching in fascination as Blake spoke in low, steady tones to the frightened animal, gradually moving closer until he could place a hand on its heaving flank. The stallion quivered but stopped fighting, its dark eyes rolling as it assessed this human who refused to be intimidated. "That's it," Blake murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "No one's going to hurt you here." It was a side of Blake that Ruby hadn't seen before, patient, gentle, yet commanding respect. The transformation was remarkable, and she found herself unable to look away from his tall figure as he continued to calm the nervous stallion. One of the ranch hands noticed her watching and grinned. "Boss has a way with the wild ones. Never seen anyone better at gentling horses." "He's clearly gifted," Ruby agreed, still observing as Blake led the stallion to a smaller corral, his movements deliberate and confident. Later that afternoon, Ruby brought lunch to Blake, who was still working with the black stallion. He accepted the food with a nod of thanks, his shirt damp with sweat and his face streaked with dust. "He's magnificent," Ruby said, gesturing to the horse who was now watching them warily from the opposite side of the corral. "What's his name?" "Midnight," Blake replied. "Caught him with a small herd in the North Ranges. He's the finest specimen I've seen in years, perfect conformation, strong legs, intelligent." He bit into the sandwich Ruby had brought. "Thank you for this." "You're welcome," she replied, hesitating before adding, "I've never seen anyone work with horses the way you do. It's remarkable." Blake's expression softened slightly. "My mother loved horses. She taught me that force accomplishes nothing, it's patience and understanding that wins their trust. Wise advice for dealing with most living creatures," Ruby commented. Blake's gaze shifted to her, his eyes studying her face with new interest. "Yes, I suppose it is." After a moment he asked, "Would you like to try?" "Try what?" Approaching Midnight, Ruby glanced at the nervous stallion. "Oh, I couldn't possibly. I think you could," Blake said. "He's calmer now. Just move slowly and let him come to you." Gathering her courage, Ruby stepped carefully into the corral, following Blake's quiet instructions. "Hold your hand out, palm up. Don't look directly at him, that's threatening to a horse." Ruby did as instructed, heart hammering as the massive black stallion regarded her suspiciously, then, to her astonishment, took several cautious steps toward her. After what seemed an eternity, soft velvet nostrils touched her palm, sniffing curiously. "He likes you," Blake said, his voice carrying a note of surprise and something else approval. "Most horses can sense fear or uncertainty, but they also recognize gentleness." Ruby couldn't help the smile that spread across her face as Midnight allowed her to gently stroke his nose. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me meet him." When she finally stepped back from the corral, Blake was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Ramsey," he said quietly. "In what way?" she asked. "You adapt. You face challenges without complaint." He hesitated. "It's a rare quality." Before Ruby could respond, one of the ranch hands called Blake away to deal with a problem at the cattle pens. She returned to the house, the brief connection with both the horse and its owner lingering in her mind. The next few days brought spring storms that kept most work confined to the buildings. Ruby used the time to deep clean areas of the house that had been neglected, including the formal parlor that had apparently gone unused since Mrs. Valmont's death. She found a portrait of Blake's mother on the mantel, dusty but otherwise well-preserved, showing a handsome woman with Blake's same intense eyes and strong features. "You resemble her," Gerald Valmont said from the doorway, startling Ruby, who hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude on private memories," she said, carefully returning the portrait to its place. Gerald shook his head. "No need for apologies. Elizabeth would have hated seeing her parlor in such disuse." He moved into the room, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "Blake takes after her in many ways, stubborn, principled, fiercely loyal. He seems very dedicated to the ranch," Ruby observed, resuming her cleaning of the woodwork. "Too dedicated, perhaps," Gerald sighed. Elizabeth always worried he'd become too solitary, too focused on the work to build a life of his own. The older man studied Ruby thoughtfully. "He was engaged once, about 6 years ago." Ruby paused in her work, surprised by this revelation. "I didn't know. City girl from Denver." Caroline was her name, beautiful, accomplished, 10 years his junior. Gerald's expression darkened. "She lasted exactly 3 months here before declaring ranch life primitively dull and returning east. Blake hasn't courted anyone since." "I'm sorry to hear that," Ruby said sincerely. It must have been painful for him, Gerald nodded, made him wary especially of city women. He looked pointedly at Ruby, though you seem cut from different cloth. Before Ruby could formulate a response to this rather direct assessment, the conversation was interrupted by Blake himself, entering with an armful of firewood. He stopped short when he saw them in the parlor, his gaze moving from his father to Ruby and back again. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he said stiffly. "Not at all," Gerald replied easily. "Miss Ramsey was just bringing Elizabeth's parlor back to life, about time too." Blake's expression softened as he looked around the room, noticing the cleaned windows, polished furniture, and fresh wildflowers Ruby had arranged in a crystal vase. "It looks like it used to," he said quietly. "Mother would have appreciated that." For the remainder of the day, Blake seemed to be watching Ruby with new awareness, his gaze following her as she moved about her duties. At dinner, he even engaged her in conversation about her life in Philadelphia, listening with genuine interest to her descriptions of the city and her father's business. The next morning dawned clear and bright after the storms, and Blake surprised Ruby by asking if she would accompany him on a ride to check fence lines in the eastern pasture. "It would be good for you to know the boundaries of the property," he explained. "And the exercise would do us both good after being cooped up during the rains." Ruby agreed readily, changing into her most serviceable skirt and borrowing a pair of leather riding gloves from a hook by the door. Blake had saddled a gentle bay mare for her, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her height. "Daisy's even-tempered," he said, helping Ruby mount. "She'll follow Ranger's lead without fuss." He nodded toward his own mount, a powerful chestnut gelding waiting patiently nearby. They rode east across land still damp from the recent rains, the spring grass vivid green against the darker pines in the distance. Blake pointed out landmarks as they traveled a lightning-struck tree that marked the corner of Valmont property, a natural spring that provided water year-round, the distant peaks of mountains still capped with snow. "It's breathtaking," Ruby said as they paused on a rise overlooking a valley where a small herd of Valmont cattle grazed. "I never imagined such vastness when I was in Philadelphia." "Do you miss the city?" Blake asked, studying her profile. Ruby considered the question. "I miss certain conveniences, bookshops, theaters, the familiarity of it all. But there's something about this land that speaks to the soul in a way city streets never could." Blake nodded, seeming pleased with her answer. "It gets in your blood," he agreed. "I tried living in Denver for a year after college. Couldn't wait to get back to open sky and honest work." They continued riding, checking fences and water sources, Blake occasionally dismounting to make minor repairs. Ruby watched him work, admiring the efficiency of his movements and the obvious care he took in maintaining the ranch infrastructure. "My father tells me you were once engaged," Ruby said when they stopped to rest the horses by a small creek. The words slipped out before she could reconsider their propriety. Blake stiffened slightly. "He shouldn't be sharing my personal history with employees." "I apologize," Ruby said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." Blake sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his dark hair. "No, I'm sorry." That was ungracious. He replaced his hat, adjusting the brim against the sun. "Yes, I was engaged briefly. It ended poorly." "I understand why you might be cautious about city women then," Ruby ventured. Blake's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. Caroline was 24, beautiful, educated at an Eastern finishing school. On paper, the perfect rancher's wife. His expression hardened. In reality, she viewed the ranch as a rustic vacation, not a life or livelihood. "That must have been difficult," Ruby said softly. "It was enlightening," Blake corrected. "I learned that shared values matter more than superficial attractions." He looked directly at Ruby. "What about you? No husband waiting back east?" Ruby shook her head. "No, my father's illness consumed much of my 20s. By the time he passed, I found myself." She hesitated, considered past my prime for marriage prospects. "By whose assessment?" Blake asked sharply. Societies, I suppose, Ruby replied. In Philadelphia, most women are married by 22. By 30, one is firmly on the shelf. Blake snorted. Eastern foolishness. Out here, we value capability over calendar years. It was almost the same phrase he'd used when they first met, but this time his tone held genuine conviction rather than mere politeness. They resumed riding, the conversation shifting to less personal topics, but something had changed between them, a new ease, a tentative understanding. When they returned to the ranch late that afternoon, Blake helped Ruby dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist as her feet touched the ground. "Thank you for accompanying me today," he said, his voice lower than usual. "It's been a while since I've had pleasant company on my rounds." Ruby smiled up at him. "Thank you for showing me the ranch. It helped me understand why you love it so deeply." That evening, Ruby was surprised to find Blake in the kitchen after dinner, sleeves rolled up as he dried dishes that Hank was washing. When he saw her puzzled expression, he shrugged. "My mother insisted all Valmont men know how to manage basic household tasks, said no woman should be expected to do everything." "A woman ahead of her time," Ruby commented, picking up a towel to help. "She would have liked you," Blake said unexpectedly. "She valued practical intelligence and hard work over pretension." The compliment warmed Ruby more than seemed reasonable, and she focused on carefully drying a delicate teacup to hide her pleased expression. As her 2-week trial period drew to a close, Ruby found herself increasingly anxious about the possibility of leaving the Valmont ranch. She had grown attached not only to the place, but to its people, Gerald's dry humor and hidden sentimentality, Hank's gruff kindness, and most of all, Blake's quiet strength and emerging warmth toward her. On the evening before her trial was to end, Ruby was sitting on the front porch, enjoying the sunset after a day of particularly satisfying work reorganizing the ranch's supply system. Blake joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, one of which he offered to her. "Thank you," she said, accepting the steaming mug. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching as the western sky transformed into a canvas of pink, orange, and deepening blue. Finally, Blake cleared his throat. "Your trial period ends tomorrow," he said, staring into his coffee. "Yes," Ruby replied, her heart quickening. "Has my work been satisfactory?" Blake looked at her then, his expression serious. "More than satisfactory. You've transformed the house and the accounts in ways I didn't think possible." He hesitated. "Father and I would like you to stay on permanently if you're willing." Relief washed through Ruby. "I'd like that very much." Blake nodded, a smile touching his lips. "Good." He seemed about to say something more when the dinner bell rang, calling them inside. Spring gave way to summer, and Ruby settled fully into life at the Valmont ranch. Her room gradually accumulated small personal touches: wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, a patchwork quilt purchased from a traveling peddler, books borrowed from Blake's surprisingly extensive library. The house itself transformed under her care, becoming more a home than the functional shelter it had been when she arrived. Blake, too, was changing, his reserve gradually giving way to a more open demeanor, at least with Ruby. They fell into a pattern of evening conversations on the porch or in the parlor, discussing books they'd both read, sharing stories of their disparate upbringings, or simply enjoying quiet companionship after busy days. One particularly hot July afternoon, Ruby was returning from the garden with a basket of vegetables when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main road. Curious, she rounded the house to see Blake in confrontation with a well-dressed stranger whose expensive carriage stood nearby. "As I've told you repeatedly, Mr. Harrison, the Valmont ranch is not for sale," Blake was saying, his posture tense. "Not now, not ever." "Every property has its price, Valmont," the stranger replied smoothly. "Your neighbor Peterson already agreed to sell. Your ranch would complete my holdings in this valley. Then you'll have an incomplete collection," Blake responded coldly. "Good day, sir." As Harrison departed, Blake noticed Ruby watching from near the porch. His expression was troubled as he approached her. "Sorry you had to witness that," he said. "Harrison represents Eastern investors looking to consolidate ranches for a cattle corporation." "You've refused to sell before?" Ruby asked. Blake nodded, his jaw tight. "3 times in the past year, they're becoming more persistent." "Is the ranch in financial difficulty?" Ruby asked cautiously. Though she managed the accounts, some aspects of the ranch's financial situation remained outside her purview. Blake hesitated. "Not dire, but not as secure as I'd like. 2 poor seasons in a row have depleted our reserves." He ran a hand through his hair in a gesture Ruby had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "But selling isn't an option. This land is Valmont legacy." Ruby touched his arm lightly. "Then we'll find another solution." Blake looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. "We?" He asked softly. Ruby's cheeks warmed. "I only meant, the ranch's welfare concerns us all." Blake covered her hand with his own. "Thank you," he said simply. That evening, unable to sleep, Ruby returned to the account books, searching for ways to improve the ranch's financial position. She was still working by lamplight when Blake found her in the early hours of the morning. "You should be resting," he said, echoing words he'd spoken months earlier, though his tone now held concern rather than mere politeness. "I had an idea about the horse breeding program," Ruby explained, showing him the figures she'd been calculating. "If we focus on quality over quantity, targeting wealthy buyers in Denver and San Francisco." She detailed her proposal, watching as Blake's expression shifted from skepticism to interest. "This could work," he said finally, studying the projections she'd made. "With Midnight as our foundation stallion, we could develop a line known for both beauty and endurance." He looked up at her with new respect. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Ruby smiled slightly. "My father was a businessman before he was an invalid. I learned from watching him." Blake shook his head in wonderment. "You continue to amaze me, Ruby Ramsey." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected thrill through her. As summer progressed into fall, Ruby's strategy for the horse breeding program began to show promise. Blake traveled to Denver to make connections with potential buyers, returning with both contracts and renewed optimism. The ranch's financial outlook improved steadily, though not dramatically enough to end all concerns. One crisp September evening, Blake invited Ruby to accompany him to check on a mare about to foal. They walked to the stable together, the night air carrying the first hint of autumn chill. Inside, the pregnant mare was restless in her stall, and Blake spoke to her soothingly as he checked her condition. "Won't be long now," he told Ruby. "First births are often difficult. I'd like to stay with her." "I'll keep you company," Ruby offered, settling onto a hay bale near the stall. They talked quietly as they waited, Blake sharing stories of horses he had bred and trained over the years. When the mare finally began active labor, Ruby watched in awe as Blake gently assisted, his large hands incredibly gentle as he helped bring new life into the world. The foal emerged wet and wobbly, its mother immediately beginning to clean it while Blake ensured both were healthy. The look of pure joy on his face as the newborn struggled to its feet for the first time took Ruby's breath away. "Isn't she perfect?" Blake asked, his voice hushed with wonder. "Look at those legs, she'll be a runner." Ruby moved closer, enchanted by the scene. "She's beautiful," she agreed, watching as the foal nursed for the first time. "What will you name her?" Blake looked at Ruby, then back at the foal with its reddish-brown coat just visible beneath the birthing fluids. "Ruby," he said softly. "We'll call her Ruby." Their eyes met over the stall door, and something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that had been building for months. Blake reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind Ruby's ear, his fingertips lingering against her cheek. "Ruby," he said again, her name becoming something entirely different on his lips, not just a name but a declaration. "Blake," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned closer, hesitated, then pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. When they separated, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected you," he murmured. Never expected to feel this way again, especially not for a city woman with practical shoes and impeccable bookkeeping. Ruby laughed softly, her heart full. "And I never expected a stubborn rancher with dirt under his fingernails and poetry books hidden in his desk drawer." Blake smiled, the expression transforming his face. "We should get back to the house," he said reluctantly. "Father will be wondering where we are." They walked hand in hand through the moonlit yard, stopping once more to kiss beneath the stars before reluctantly separating at the kitchen door. The following weeks were filled with stolen moments between responsibilities' hands touching when passing tools, private smiles across the dinner table, conversations that lasted late into the evening. Gerald watched them with knowing eyes but said nothing, though Ruby often caught him looking pleased when Blake sought out her company. Their first public outing as a couple came in late October when Blake escorted Ruby to Silver Springs for the Harvest Festival. As they walked among the stalls and displays, Ruby was acutely aware of curious glances and whispered comments from townsfolk who recognized her as the too mature woman who had been unable to find employment months earlier. "Something amusing?" Blake asked when she smiled to herself. "Just thinking about how differently I'm received now that I'm on your arm," Ruby replied honestly. "When I first arrived, no business in town would hire me because I was considered too old at 34. Blake's expression darkened. "Fools," he muttered, then stopped walking to face her directly. "Ruby, do you know why I was initially hesitant about hiring you?" She shook her head. "I was afraid you'd be like Caroline Young, beautiful and completely unsuited to ranch life." His mouth quirked in a self-deprecating smile. "I assumed a woman from the city would be fragile and demanding, regardless of her age." "And now?" Ruby asked softly. "Now I know better," Blake replied. "You're the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known. Your age isn't a liability, it's part of what makes you who you are." He took her hand, uncaring of who might see. "You have an assurance, a wisdom that comes from experience. You know who you are." Ruby's heart swelled at his words. "Most men prefer younger women," she said quietly. "I'm not most men," Blake replied firmly, "and you're not most women." He squeezed her hand. "You're timeless to me, Ruby, not defined by years but by the strength and grace with which you live each day." Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes. "Blake Valmont, you'll make me cry in the middle of the town square," he grinned, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. "Can't have that. What would the gossips say?" As they continued their tour of the festival, Ruby noticed Edith from the milliner's shop watching them with unconcealed surprise. Blake followed her gaze and raised an eyebrow in question. "An acquaintance from my boarding house days," Ruby explained. "She's the one who told me about the position at your ranch." "Then I owe her my thanks," Blake said seriously. "Shall we say hello?" Edith's eyes widened as they approached. "Miss Ramsey, how lovely to see you. We'd heard you found employment outside town, but I had no idea." Her gaze flicked to Blake, then their joined hands. Ruby made the introductions, enjoying Edith's poorly concealed astonishment at the obvious affection between them. "Will you be staying on at the Valmont Ranch, then?" Edith asked, curiosity evident in her voice. Before Ruby could answer, Blake spoke. "If I have my way, she'll be staying permanently," he said, his tone leaving little doubt about his intentions. Ruby's heart skipped a beat at the implication, and she glanced up to find Blake watching her with such open adoration that she temporarily forgot how to breathe. They returned to the ranch that evening to find Gerald waiting for them in the parlor, an unusual occurrence given his early habits. His expression was grave as he gestured for them to join him. "Harrison came back today," the elder Valmont said without preamble. "He's raised his offer considerably." He handed Blake a letter containing figures that made Ruby's eyebrows rise. "It doesn't matter what he offers," Blake said firmly. "We're not selling," Gerald sighed. I know that's your position, son, but Harrison made it clear they'll pursue other methods if we continue to refuse. They've already bought water rights upstream from our north pasture. Blake's jaw tightened. They can't legally prevent our access to water. They can make it difficult, Gerald pointed out, and expensive to fight. Ruby listened to their discussion with growing concern. The financial improvements they'd made were real but not sufficient to withstand a protracted legal battle with wealthy Eastern investors. But the ranch was more than a business to the Valmonts. It was their heritage, their home, their identity. "May I see the offer?" she asked, holding out her hand for the letter. Blake passed it to her, watching as she read through the details carefully. After several minutes of silence, she looked up. "This is actually quite interesting," she said thoughtfully. "They're not just offering money, they're proposing a partnership structure that would allow the Valmont family to maintain operational control while providing capital for expansion." Blake frowned. Partnership with Eastern investors means answering to distant shareholders who care nothing for the land or its traditions. "Not necessarily," Ruby countered. "With the right legal protections in place, you could secure both the capital you need and the autonomy you value." She outlined a potential counterproposal that would give the investors financial participation without operational control, using the successful horse breeding program as leverage. Both Valmont men listened intently, Gerald nodding occasionally while Blake's expression moved from skepticism to consideration. "It could work," Gerald said finally, "especially with Ruby managing the financial side of things." Blake looked at Ruby with new appreciation. "You continue to save us, it seems." "I'm simply protecting what matters," she replied softly. Later that night, after Gerald had retired, Blake found Ruby in the parlor, staring thoughtfully into the fire. He sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing possibilities where I saw only threats." Ruby squeezed his hand. "The ranch matters to me too, Blake, not just because it's your legacy, but because it's become my home." Blake's expression grew serious. "I want it to truly be your home, Ruby." He shifted to face her directly. "These past months have shown me what I was missing, not just an efficient housekeeper or clever bookkeeper, but a partner in every sense." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Ruby Ramsey. Will you marry me?" Joy bloomed in Ruby's chest, so intense it almost hurt. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I'm still 34, still from Philadelphia, still—" Blake silenced her with a kiss. "You're still perfect," he murmured against her lips. "Still the woman I want to build a life with. Age is just a number, Ruby. What matters is the heart, the mind, the soul, and yours match mine in ways I never thought possible." "Then yes," Ruby whispered, tears of happiness spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Blake Valmont." They were married the following spring in the parlor that Ruby had restored, with Gerald beaming as he gave her away, and the ranch hands dressed in their Sunday best as witnesses. The bride wore a simple gown of ivory silk ordered from Denver, her grandmother's ruby pendant at her throat matching the flowers in her bouquet. As Blake took her hands to speak his vows, he looked into her eyes with such love that Ruby knew she had found not just employment or security, but the one thing she had never expected to find when she journeyed west, a man who saw her true worth, who valued her experience rather than counting her years, who loved her not despite her age, but with full appreciation of the woman those years had shaped. "You're timeless to me, Ruby," he whispered as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "And I intend to spend every day proving it." In the years that followed, the Valmont Ranch prospered under their joint management. Ruby's counterproposal to Harrison's investors proved successful, providing capital for expansion while preserving the ranch's independence. The horse breeding program gained national recognition, with Midnight's Ruby, the foal born the night of their first kiss, winning prestigious races in Denver and beyond. Gerald lived to welcome 2 grandchildren, a boy with Blake's determined spirit and a girl with Ruby's practical intelligence, before peacefully passing in his sleep at the age of 82. The portrait of Elizabeth Valmont remained in the parlor, joined by a new one of the expanded family, symbolizing the blending of past and present into a future neither Blake nor Ruby could have imagined when fate first brought them together. And on quiet evenings, they still sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky, marveling at how love had found them when they least expected it, proving that some things, like the land they cherished and the feelings they shared, were truly timeless.